So one night, when I was asleep, they sent their hired hands to set my orchard on fire. The flames spread faster than I could react, the crackling sound filling the air as the fire consumed my trees. I could only watch helplessly from my window as the fire roared through the orchard. I thought everything was lost, but then something impossible happened. The fire, which had started in my orchard, began to shift as though it had a mind of its own. The flames didn't stay confined to the orchard or die down like I had expected. No, they reversed, as if the earth itself was rejecting the destruction. The fire turned, almost deliberately, and began heading back toward the upscale homes at the top of the hill. Homes belonging to Karen and the other HOA board members. I watched, stunned, as the flames slithered toward their $3 million estates, reducing their pristine, carefully manicured mansions to nothing but blazing ruins. What was happening didn't make any sense. How could the fire reverse its course? But one thing was crystal clear. The HOA who had orchestrated the destruction of my orchard was now watching as their wealth and power went up in flames. The very homes they had used to assert their dominance were being consumed by the very thing they thought would crush me. For once, I didn't feel helpless. I wasn't the victim anymore. Nature had a different plan, and it was delivering its own kind of justice. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. It all started with a letter from the HOA at first. I didn't think much of it. Karen, the HOA president, had been sending me complaints for months, but they were always about trivial things. One time, it was because my lawn wasn't perfectly manicured according to their standards. Another time, it was because I didn't trim my hedge at the exact angle they wanted. Every time, I thought, what's next? They can't be serious. But this time, it's different. The letter came in the mail, one Tuesday morning, and as soon as I saw the sender, I knew it was bad news. It was from Karen, the HOA president. The subject line was in bold, final notice, violation of water conservation policies. I couldn't believe what I was reading. The letter stated that I had violated the neighborhood's newly enforced water use restrictions, and they demanded that I stop watering my orchard immediately. I'd been taking care of that orchard for over a decade. It was something I had poured my heart and soul into. I planted those trees, pruned them, made sure they were properly watered, and ensured they thrived in the most responsible way possible. But Karen and the HOA didn't care about any of that. They didn't care that the orchard was carefully maintained or that I'd taken every precaution to make sure it didn't waste water. To them, it was a violation of their policies. And that was all that mattered. It was ridiculous. They wanted to dictate what I could do with my own land. They wanted to control every aspect of my property, from the color of my mailbox to how much water I could use on my trees. They wanted to dictate what I could reality of the situation. They just made arbitrary rules and expected everyone to follow them. I dealt with Karen's constant interference for years. But this crossed the line. This wasn't about keeping up appearances or some random aesthetic rule. This was personal. I wasn't going to stand for it anymore. At first I thought, maybe I can just pay the fine and be done with it. It's easier that way, right? I could have just given up, accepted their judgment, and moved on. But the more I thought about it, the angrier I became. I'd fought so hard for my orchard. It wasn't just a piece of land. It was a symbol of everything I had worked for. I wasn't about to let some self-righteous people with too much time and too much power tell me what I could or couldn't do with it. So I decided to fight back. But I didn't just want to fight them on this. I called up a lawyer, prepared myself for a battle, and started gathering everything I could to show that the HOA had no right to force me to destroy my orchard. It wasn't just about the trees anymore. It was about standing up for what I believed in. It was about showing Karen and the board that they couldn't just push people around and get away with it. But even as I prepared for this legal fight, something felt off. It wasn't just the rules they were already overstepping. I'd heard rumors from other neighbors who'd been bullied into submission by the HOA. People who had fought back in the past had been driven out of the neighborhood. Some had moved away because they couldn't handle the pressure. Others had given in, letting the HOA push them around until they complied with whatever ridiculous rule the board came up with next. And that's when it hit me. Karen wasn't just trying to enforce policies, she was trying to control us. Control me. And that's when I knew I couldn't just let them win. As I started preparing for the legal battle, I couldn't help but think about how far the HOA had pushed things. They weren't just enforcing policies, they were running the neighborhood with an iron fist. No one questioned them. No one stood up to them. They were untouchable. They controlled everything, from what kind of grass you could grow to what color your house could be painted. I mean, who even gets that much power? But I wasn't going to back down. I wasn't going to be another person who caved in to the pressure. I started talking to other neighbors who had been harassed by the HOA. I started gathering stories of how they'd been pushed out, how they'd been fined for the dumbest things, and how Karen had made their lives miserable just because they didn't conform. These weren't just isolated incidents. This was a pattern, a system that Karen and the board had been running for years. They used fear and intimidation to keep everyone in line. But I wasn't afraid anymore. The more I talked to people, the angrier I became. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules, they were using them to destroy lives. People who didn't follow their rules were driven out of the neighborhood. People who didn't pay up were penalized or fined out of existence. They thought they could break you, and most people did break. They didn't have the time, the resources, or the energy to fight back. They just let the HOA wear them down until they had no choice but to give in. But not me. Not this time. I remember one neighbor, Dave, who had been fined multiple times for the tiniest infractions, like having a tree branch that hung too low or a crack in his driveway. Eventually, they forced him to sell his house. He didn't want to, but he couldn't keep up with the constant pressure. I remember him telling me, the HOA doesn't just want your money, they want your life. They'll wear you down until you're broken, and that's exactly what they had been trying to do to me. But they underestimated me. They thought I'd just give up, like all the others. But I wasn't like everyone else. I had spent years fighting for what I had. I wasn't going to lose my orchard because of a stupid rule. I wasn't going to let them take away something that meant everything to me. I prepared myself for the battle. I started working with my lawyer, gathering documents, looking into their tactics, and researching how I could fight back. I wasn't just going to challenge them on the water restriction. They'd crossed the line, and I was going to expose them for the bullies they were. But even then, as I was getting ready, I kept thinking, was this going to be enough? Was I ready for what was coming next? I thought I was prepared for the fight, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. Karen and the HOA were about to make a move that would change everything. The fire. But not in the way I expected. The weeks after Karen's letter felt like a pressure cooker. Every time I looked out the window, I saw the orchard. The trees stood tall and healthy, but the thought that they could be taken away, that someone could just come in and rip them out because of some dumb rule, ate away at me. I had always been proud of that orchard. It wasn't just an investment, it was personal. Those trees weren't just part of my yard, they were my work, my pride, and the memories I'd built around them. So when Karen and her HOA decided to try and strip that away from me, I knew I had no choice but to stand up to them. I knew the HOA was going to push back harder once they saw that I wasn't going to let it slide. But I didn't expect them to turn the heat up this fast. It wasn't long before they started sending me notice after notice. The first one was a fine for an improper structure in my backyard. It was a shed, barely bigger than a tool closet. Nothing more than a small wooden box with a roof that I used to store my gardening equipment. I'd built it myself years ago. But now, according to Karen and her HOA, it violated community standards. What did they expect me to do? Tear it down? Get rid of it? I refused. Then, a week later, I received another letter. This time, they were complaining about the excessive vegetation on my property. Too many plants was the official reason. The letter was filled with vague language about not maintaining an aesthetically pleasing environment and how unapproved plants are seen as a violation of neighborhood harmony. Harmony. My yard was fine. It had always been fine, But Karen and the board wanted control over every detail of our lives. They wanted to tell us what to plant, what color our houses could be, and how our lawns should look. It wasn't about the plants, the shed, or even the trees. It was about them trying to dictate how we lived. I started to get angry, really angry. I wasn't going to let them destroy my orchard. I wasn't going to let them win. But I knew it wouldn't be easy. Karen wasn't just a random neighbor who thought she could impose a few rules. She was the HOA president, the leader of a group of people who used their power to make others miserable. It wasn't just a few rules. It was a system designed to break people down. And it had worked. I started talking to other neighbors, the ones who had lived in the neighborhood longer than me. I spoke to Dave, who had lived across the street for over 20 years. Dave was a quiet guy, always minding his own business. But he'd been pushed around by the HOA so many times that I could see the frustration in his eyes. They've been doing this for years, he told me, shaking his head. First, it's the grass. Then it's the fence. Then they tell you your mailbox isn't the right size. And before you know it, you're paying fines, tearing stuff down, and then they make you leave. Another neighbor, Sue, had been fined for having a few pots with flowers on her front porch. She told me how the HOA had fined her 3 times in a row for non-compliant outdoor decorations. 3 fines for some flowers. In the end, she gave in, paid the fines, and threw out the pots. But I could tell she was bitter about it. Everyone was. It was like the HOA had turned into a monster that was always there, watching, waiting for you to make a mistake, to slip up just once. That's when it hit me, Karen. And the HOA weren't just about enforcing rules. They were about control. They wanted to make us feel small, helpless, like our lives were their property to manage. But I wasn't going to stand for it. I knew what was coming next. They'd try to make me sell my house. Or worse, just drive me out of the neighborhood. It was their MO. The way they had done it to so many others. They pushed until the person broke or caved. But I wasn't like the others. I wasn't going to just give up. I called up a lawyer. I knew I had to do this the right way, through the legal channels, or they'd try to paint me as some radical troublemaker. So I started gathering evidence, organizing the documents, and preparing for the fight of my life. But even as I was getting ready, I kept thinking, what if they found some other way to get to me? They had the resources, the power, and the authority to drag this out for years. But I wasn't about to give up. I spent the next few days running around town, getting my ducks in a row. I spent hours in the library, reading up on the legal side of things, how the HOA had been getting away with all of this, the rules they'd manipulated, the fines they'd imposed on other homeowners. Every time I uncovered more dirt, my anger grew. They had been doing this to people for years, and no one ever fought back. But I wasn't just fighting for my orchard anymore. I was fighting for everyone who had been too scared to stand up. I was fighting for the people who had been bullied into silence, who had been pushed out of their homes, because they didn't have the strength or the resources to challenge the HOA. I was going to change things, but I still had no idea what Karen had in store. It wasn't long before things took a turn. I started getting reports from neighbors. Some of them were too afraid to speak up directly, but I heard from enough people to know that Karen wasn't going to stop with the legal battle. She wasn't going to just sit back and let the system handle it. She was going to take matters into her own hands, and that's when I first heard about the contractors. A neighbor of mine, Greg, had seen some workers coming and going near my orchard. At first, he thought they were just landscapers, but then he realized they were HOA contractors. I couldn't believe it. They were already out there, working on my property, tearing up the ground, cutting down trees. It was happening. I rushed to the orchard, panic rising in my chest as I drove down the street. When I got there, the sight was worse than I imagined. There were men in hard hats cutting branches from my trees, pulling up my plants like they were weeds. I couldn't believe it. I ran up to them, shouting at them to stop, but they just looked at me, unfazed. "We're just doing our job," one of them said, like it was nothing. "The HOA hired us. You can take it up with them." But it wasn't just taking it up with the HOA that I had in mind. I was going to make them pay for this. I had a legal team, evidence, and the determination to take this all the way. But right now, all I could do was stand there and watch, as they destroyed the one thing I'd worked hardest to build. I couldn't just sit back anymore. It wasn't enough to challenge them in court. No, they needed to feel what it was like to lose everything. They needed to understand that their power was not absolute. And as the contractors continued to tear apart my orchard, a plan began to form in my mind. A plan that would change everything. But what I didn't realize yet was that nature was about to take care of things in a way no one could have predicted. It all happened so fast, I barely had time to process it. One afternoon, Greg, a neighbor of mine, called me in a panic. His voice was shaking as he told me there was a fire near my orchard. At first, I didn't think much of it. Fires in the area weren't uncommon, especially during dry spells. I figured it was just some grass burning, or maybe a small brush fire that would be under control in no time. But then Greg told me that the flames were spreading quickly, faster than anyone could have expected, and he thought it might be headed toward my trees. That's when my heart sank. I told him I was on my way and immediately jumped into my truck. As I sped down the road, I could see a thick column of smoke rising into the air. The closer I got, the more I realized how bad it really was. I could feel the heat even from a distance, and the smoke was so thick I could barely see through it. The air was filled with the smell of burning wood. When I pulled up to my orchard, I froze. The fire had already reached the edge of the trees, and the flames were climbing higher by the second. It was as if the fire had a mind of its own, moving and spreading quickly, tearing through everything in its path. I felt helpless, watching as my trees, my pride, were being consumed by the flames. The orchard I had worked so hard to grow, the trees I had nurtured for over a decade, were turning to ash before my eyes. I tried calling the fire department, but the fire was already too far gone. There was nothing anyone could do. My heart felt like it was being torn out. As I stood there, watching my orchard burn, I thought about all the things I had fought for, the rules the HOA had imposed on me, the countless times Karen had sent complaints, the constant pressure they put on me to conform. This was the HOA's doing. They had pushed me too far, and now they were about to see what the consequences of their actions would be. But just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, something strange happened. The wind picked up. It was just a gust at first, and I didn't think much of it. But then I realized the wind wasn't pushing the fire away. It was steering it, like the fire had a purpose of its own. The flames began to shift direction, moving away from the orchard, and toward the hill where the HO board members lived. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The fire was reversing its course, and for the first time, I wasn't the one who was powerless. It was as if the fire knew that Karen and the board were responsible for this destruction. It wasn't my trees that were going to be burned anymore. The fire had changed direction, and it was heading straight for their expensive mansions. I stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to look away as the flames danced closer to Karen's house. I could see it from where I stood. The mansion on the hill, the one with the manicured lawn, the one that had always made me feel small and insignificant, the one that symbolized everything the HOA stood for, power, control, and privilege. And now the fire was coming for it. The flames weren't just spreading in random directions, they were focused, moving with intent, and headed straight for the houses of the HOA members. At first, I thought it was just the wind. But as I watched, I realized something else was happening. The fire wasn't just drifting away. It was actively chasing down those homes, leaping across the grass, setting the dry lawns on fire. It didn't stop. The fire reached the edge of Karen's property, and then, like a beast unleashed, it surged forward, eating up the luxurious house, turning the massive estate into an inferno. I could hear the crackling as the flames tore through the roof, shattering windows, and the bright glow from the fire made it impossible to look away. But it wasn't just Karen's home that was going up in flames. The fire spread to the other homes on the hill, homes belonging to the other members of the HOA board. Each one of those houses was worth millions of dollars, meticulously maintained and cared for, just like the control they tried to have over the rest of us. And now, All of it was burning. I stood there watching as the fire slowly consumed their mansions, the very homes they had used to build their sense of power over the rest of us. For once, they were helpless. They weren't in control. It wasn't just my orchard burning anymore. It was their empires going up in smoke. And in that moment, I realized something that I hadn't fully understood before. The fire wasn't just some random occurrence. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't fate. It was retribution. The fire was justice, a response to everything the HOA had done, a balance being restored. They had tried to destroy me, to strip away what I had worked for. But in the end, they were the ones who were losing everything. It was poetic, in a way. All the destruction they had caused, all the lives they had ruined, was coming back to them, and they couldn't stop it. The fire didn't care about who had money or power. It didn't care about who thought they were untouchable. It was relentless, unforgiving, and completely out of their control. I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction as I watched the flames reach their peak. There was something almost sweet about the way their wealth and their power crumbled in front of them. It wasn't about the money or the houses. It was about watching them finally realize that they couldn't control everything. They couldn't always win. They couldn't always impose their will on others. And no matter how powerful they thought they were, nature would always have the last word. By the time the fire department arrived, it was too late. The homes were already gone. The damage was done. There was nothing left for them to salvage. I'm sure Karen and the rest of the HOA board tried to find someone to blame, tried to make it seem like it was just an accident. But everyone knew what had happened. Everyone saw how the fire had moved with such purpose, how it had burned down their mansions after everything they had done to me. It wasn't an accident. It was karma. And it had come for them. In the days that followed, there were investigations. Fire officials and insurance companies got involved, trying to figure out how the fire had spread so quickly, how it had reversed course and headed straight for the HOA members' homes. But no one could explain it. No one could find a logical reason for how the fire had behaved the way it had. To me, though, it was simple. It was nature's way of delivering what the HOA deserved. It was justice, plain and simple. And I wasn't going to feel bad about it. In the aftermath of the fire, things moved quickly. The HOA board members, once so confident in their control over the neighborhood, were left reeling. Karen, who had spent years using her position to bully others, suddenly found herself powerless. Their multi-million-dollar homes were gone. Nothing but charred remains. The insurance companies were involved, but they quickly realized they had no way to explain the fire's path, no way to justify how it had reversed and headed straight for the very people who had caused all this chaos. Investigations began, but nothing could fully explain what happened. The fire department said it was an anomaly, a freak occurrence. They couldn't understand. The police were baffled. But in the end, they couldn't find anyone to blame. The HOA tried to claim it was an act of arson, but the evidence didn't support that. No one could prove a thing. The media got involved, too, and the story spread like wildfire. How the once powerful HOA had been reduced to rubble. People started talking. Neighbors who had been too afraid to stand up to Karen and her crew began speaking out, telling their stories of the HOA's endless harassment and how they had suffered in silence for years. And then there was me. I had fought for my orchard, fought for my rights, and in the end, I had won. But it wasn't just about the orchard anymore. It was about the entire neighborhood. It was about standing up to the bullies, the ones who thought they could control everyone around them just because they had money. I didn't back down, and in the end, I had taken back my power. As for the HOA, well, they were finished. Karen was forced to resign, and the board members quickly scattered, each one trying to salvage what was left of their reputation. The HOA was disbanded, its power stripped away. The neighborhood, for the first time in years, felt free. People began to rebuild. Not just their homes, but their sense of community. It was like the air had cleared. There were no more rules imposed from above, no more watching over our shoulders, afraid of what would come next. And as for my orchard, it began to grow again. Slowly, but surely, I started to replant the trees that had been lost in the fire. It wasn't the same as it had been before, but it was mine, and I knew I had earned it. I had fought for it, and no one, not even the HOA, could take it away from me. The fire had given me something I hadn't expected: peace. It had shown me that, in the end, standing up for what's right always prevails. No matter how strong the opposition, no matter how powerful the enemy, the truth always finds a way to surface. And sometimes, nature itself delivers justice when the system fails. The HOA had tried to crush me, but in the end, they were the ones who were crushed, and I was free.